So while I was thinking about what what's going to come through today, I usually start by getting quiet and kind of talking to spirit. What is it? What is it that wants to come through today? What is it that people want to know? What is it that can pass through me and be of some use to somebody? And the ideas kept kind of coming around a theme, and finally it settled down on, well, what would happen if you went to a search engine like Google and you Googled for your spiritual self? You know, and you see now, you go on the internet and there's these ads, and they say, well, just type your name on this website, and it's amazing how much information they have about you, you know. And in fact, journalists have gone to these websites and paid like $40 or so to buy the information that they had collected, the website had collected about the journalists, and then they wrote an article, reported an article about how they were amazed at what they found out there. And what I was thinking about is, they know a lot about us, but it's all history. It's all in the past. And yet they know nothing of us. Nothing of us. What sites we visited, what articles we read, in some cases where we've been, what roads we've driven on. But none of that is who we are. Those are just activities. Those are just things that we have done. They are just past experiences. That's all they are. And what this comes down to is, if we ask that search engine, but what about my spiritual self? Don't tell me about human activities. Don't tell me about past history. You know, tell me about who and what I am. And it wouldn't know. It would have no way of knowing just by judging on where you've been on the internet. It would not know who you are. It would not know what you are. You could write a little program and put it on your computer, and it would randomly go out and search sites, make up words, and then go search for them. Follow the links from one site to another. And all of that would be collected in the history on the web. But that's not you. That would be a software program on your computer. Yet the world that we live in, the world as we know it, is consumed presently with this idea of gathering as much information as it possibly can about the activities of the people who use the services. And of course, this is what's causing all the controversy with governments that have privacy laws. But nevertheless, they don't know who you are. So then I started to wonder, but do we even know who we are? What do we know about our spiritual self? And why is it important? The temple for Apollo, or to Apollo, or the temple of Apollo, I'm not sure what the right term is, at Delphi, is where the famous Oracle of Delphi was. And people would go to the Oracle, and it was kind of a mist-filled room, and they would go and sit there, and they would ask a question of the Oracle, and the Oracle would give them kind of a vague answer, a non-answer, an evasive answer. And of course what this did was it made the people go within and try to interpret that answer, you know. And they would find their own answer. They would find their own answer in that search. But as they passed under the doors, as they passed under the archway to go into the temple, there was an inscription above the doorway. The inscription said, "Know thyself. Know thyself." And what struck me is, as the people were walking in to go ask someone else for advice, the oracle, they were passing under the only advice that they would ever need. Know thyself. Because if they truly had a knowing, not information, but a knowing of their true self, well, they wouldn't need to ask anybody else. See, they would find what they were looking for within. But they needed the process. I'm not saying the process is bad. Sometimes we need to talk to other people and have them listen until we just kind of find our own answers. Know thyself. Know thyself. So I think it's Paul in the New Testament. I think it's the Apostle Paul who said, what good does it do someone if you would gather up all the treasure on earth, if you would build buildings, and if you would accomplish a lot of things on earth? What good would it do if you did all that and you lost your soul? You lost your soul. And I think we're kind of saying the same thing, because if our soul is the essence of ourself, our spiritual self, the true self, if that's what our soul is, then we can't lose it. It's not something that can be lost. We can misplace it, perhaps. We can delay finding it, but we can't lose it. But what good does it do to know everything about the past, everything about daily activities, everything about what we've read, everything about opinions of us, if we don't know our own self, if we don't know who we are, why we are here, where we are going? These are the truly important things in life. And if we stop and think about, well, why is that important? Why would that even be important? We have to look at the way that societies have come together and what societies and cultures have deemed to be important and what they have done to us in the things that they have taught us and the things that we have accepted. We have to take the responsibility for allowing ourselves to believe or to buy into these things. But much of society is about doing. Do this, do that, do the other thing. Get a lot of stuff, accumulate a lot of money, build large buildings, build institutions, build organizations, get your name put up on stuff, And that seems to be the human measure of success. What have you done? How many lives have you touched? What have you done? Those sorts of things. And there's nothing wrong with those in and of themselves. I'm not putting them down. But what good would it do us if we accomplished all that and we never knew, we never discovered, we never found our soul? We never discovered the spiritual truth of our being. And if you think about all of these things, excuse me, that the world puts a premium on, none of them are permanent. They're all impermanent. This is why I believe in Buddhism, impermanence is an important teaching. We have to recognize impermanence. We have to embrace impermanence. None of those things are going to last. The largest buildings that were ever built will someday come down. The institutions that were established will someday be dissolved. The fortunes that were amassed will someday be lost or spent or squandered. Everything in the human life is impermanent. And yet, that's what human life, human culture, human ideas in society tend to put the most weight on. If you, if you think about this, and if you just, like if you go to a meet and greet somewhere, where people are networking, a networking event where people are getting together to introduce themselves to one another, and listen to how people introduce themselves. What do they talk about? And it's all past history. And none of it is the real truth of who and what they are. Well, they'll tell you their name. We all have a name, but is that who we are? Is that who we are? The name that our parents called us? The name that the minister called us as they baptized us? Is that really who we are, or is that just our name? People will talk about where they live. They'll talk about what degrees they have. They'll talk about where they went to school. They'll talk about the jobs they had. They'll talk about the things that they accomplished in their jobs. I remember when I was in corporate America, people would talk about how big their department was and how large the budget was. Well, I've got, 100 people reporting to me, my budget's $100 million a year, things like that. And the bigger your numbers were, apparently the more awe was inspired in the crowd. And none of that matters. None of that matters in the long run. All of that is going to go away. All of that is going to dissolve. So somewhere else in the New Testament, it's in a parable of Jesus, and he's telling people, he says, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is. And don't put your treasure in the things of the earth. Things that robbers can steal, things that that the moths will eat, things that will turn to rust. Put your treasure in the things of heaven. And you have to put that into context of the time and the place where Jesus was talking, because they didn't have banks like we have banks today. So what people would do is what we would call here in rural America a post hole bank. People, what they do is you have a fence line and you have all of these posts and you have wires strung against them, and one of the posts in the fence line is loose, and you can actually lift it up. There's enough slack that you can actually lift it up, and down at the bottom of that hole, what they would do is they would put a mason jar, and in that mason jar they would put all of their valuables, their money and things like that they didn't want to leave around the house in case robbers came. But their mind was never far from that post hole. It was someplace where they could see it. They wouldn't put it at the other side of the 40 acres that they were farming. They would put it somewhere near the house so they could keep their eye on it. And whatever they were doing, their mind would be there. See, wherever their treasure is, that's where their heart is. That's what they were focused on. And of course, robbers could steal it. And the interesting thing in those days was, if people would come around and ask a relative for money, not unlike today, the relative would say, "Gee, I don't have any money. I'd give it to you, but I really don't have any money." And of course, they had the money; it was buried in the post hole bank. So what folks figured out was, well, if I could find that post hole bank and steal the money, this person can't complain, because they've been telling everybody for years they don't have any money. So I can get away scot-free with robbing this money. So the robbers would try to figure out where the banks were. And of course, if the robbers didn't get it, eventually rust and moth and the elements would get it. So we're told, don't store your treasures in the things of the earth. Don't store your treasures in the things that society tells us are important, because they're not. They're not important in the long run. Yes, we need these things as we go through life. They're tools that we use. They're good to have. Nothing's wrong with them. But they are not the most important thing. They're not the most important thing in our lives. And what I'm suggesting is the most important thing in our lives is to know our spiritual self, to know ourselves, to know who and what we are as a spiritual being. And one of the biggest reasons for that is all of the things of the earth are going to turn to dust, and they're going to rust, and someday the sun will go supernova and this planet will be gone, and everything that was on it was gone, and all of the big monuments and tombstones and buildings are going to be gone. But your spiritual self will still be. So is it important? Is it important to know, to learn, to discover what our spiritual self is? Because that is what lasts. That is what is in heaven. Heaven, in the context that I think of it, heaven is our conscious awareness of our contact with the presence of the divine. To me, that's heaven. That's what heaven means. That's where our spiritual self is. That's the only place we can find our spiritual self. Dr. Holmes tells us that the only path that we have to discovering the divine is through ourselves, through our own consciousness, through coming to a realization of who and what we are, and coming to the realization, the actual experience, the actual knowing, not information about, but the actual knowing through experience, that we are a part of it, that all of it is for us, none of it can be against us, and it is expressing its life as us and through us. So in some schools from the East, we kind of get this image, this parable of the mirror. And the mirror is pure, undifferentiated consciousness. It is the I am. It is the suchness. It is the isness, the stillness, the Tao. It just is. Right? So Old Testament says, be still and know. Be still and know. It doesn't say accumulate a lot of facts. It says be still and know. And then on the mirror there's an accumulation of dust that builds up over time. And it becomes hard to see the pure mirror because of all of the dust that's on there. See, and this dust is the false ideas, the things that we have identified with in our past. Our name, the school we went to, the names of our parents, the jobs we've held, the things we've done, the books we've read, all of this browser history that you would find if you were able to go out and search for yourself on the web. But we identify with that. We think that is who we are. We think that is what we are. So when somebody asks us, well, tell me about yourself. Well, this is my name. This is where I went to school. These are the jobs I held. And none of those things are your authentic self, your real self. So the spiritual practices then, the spiritual practices that come to us from the East are practices that are designed to help us to break our identification with the dust. We are no longer the dust on the mirror. Now the mirror reflects the dust. If you could move your head a little bit from side to side, depending on how thick the glass of the mirror is, sometimes you can actually see the thing that's sitting right on the face of the mirror, and you can see its reflection in the silver on the back of the mirror. The mirror will reflect the dust. And the mirror doesn't judge the dust. But the mirror itself is not the dust. So our spiritual self then is not going to be found in the dust. Our spiritual self is not going to be found in our past. It's not going to be found in the names of our parents and our grandparents. It's not going to be found in the names of our classmates. But our spiritual self is more closely identified with the mirror that reflects these things. The consciousness that observes these things. The witness. The witness. Think of when you were a small child, and think of the size of your body, and you know, think of something memorable. Do you remember the first time you rode your bicycle without training wheels? Do you remember that? I think every kid that ever rode a bicycle, you can remember that. You know where you were. You can remember the weather. You know who was kind of pushing that bike and gave you a little nudge. And there you were riding your bike. I'm getting a call waiting coming in here. Give me just a second. There it goes. So think about where you were and how old you were when you were riding that bike. And think about this. That child no longer exists. That little body no longer exists. That consciousness that was there at that time has completely changed. But yet you remember that. You remember that. Why do you remember it? Because you were the observer. You were the witness. Now at the time you identified with the child. I'm this little 5-year-old kid, just got a new bike for Christmas, and I'm out trying to learn how to ride it. And you were caught up in the exhilaration and the enthusiasm and the excitement of riding that bicycle. And yes, that was an experience that you witnessed, an experience that you observed. But you are not your past. You are not that little child. So what we want to do is we want to move beyond identification with our experiences. And we want to strengthen our identification with the observer, the one who witnessed the true identity of the self. Now, in a similar fashion to being kind of over-identified with our past, what we tend to do is we also project into the future. So, in addition to telling everybody what we've done in our lives, we talk about the things that we're planning to do in the future. And we can get very, very caught up in our activity of planning for the future. We can get so caught up in identifying with the past and identifying with the future that we aren't present here today. We aren't here. We aren't now. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't plan for the future and you shouldn't look forward to the future. But what I'm saying is you shouldn't overly identify with that. You shouldn't get so preoccupied with the past and the future that you miss out on being here, on being now, on being in the moment. The I amness, the suchness, the isness that the spiritual teachers talk about is only in the present, only here. only now. And that is where we find it. And that is where we find ourselves. Right here. Right now. Excuse me. When we were looking at different techniques to encourage people to better manage their time, one of the programs that we used was the 7 Habits program, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits program, and he's got a matrix in there. I don't know those of you who were working back in the I guess the 80s and the 90s, everything was a 4-box matrix. This is not, that is not, and then there's a combination where they both are and then neither are. And somebody actually drew a little cartoon one day, and the drift to it was that everything in the world could be divided into a 4-box matrix, because there were those things that fit and there were those things that weren't, that wouldn't, and then you made your 4 boxes. So those of us who are facilitators, we got a chuckle out of that. But one of the things that we asked people to do was to consider the difference between what is urgent and what is important. What is urgent and what is important. Right? So the things that were urgent were typically things that they felt they had to do. They had to do them. They were urgent. There was a deadline on them. Somebody was looking for them. There was a commitment to a customer. There was a commitment to to a boss, something. And the things that were important were things that were typically longer term things. That planning and training and preparing and all of these other things that were good to do and ought to be done. But they didn't have to be done right now. And of course, there's things that are neither urgent nor important. Kind of, we would be considered time wasters. And then there were things that were both urgent and important. So we asked people to kind of consider their day, and to consider those categories, and to identify where it was that they were spending their time. And inevitably, what people found is that they were spending almost all of their time doing that which was urgent. And most of the things that they were doing that were urgent were not really important. They were just urgent. So these would be things where somebody calls your boss and says, I need Jim's department to do this for me, and they're not doing it for me, and I need you to call down there and tell them to do it. And the boss calls down and says, well, why aren't you doing this for them? And you say, well, on our list of priorities, that one doesn't even rise to the radar screen. It's something that we all agreed is not a top priority. And the boss says, well, go ahead and do it anyway. So here you are, you have something that's urgent just simply because somebody made it a political escalation, but it's not really important. And what we found is that most of our people were spending their day doing things that were urgent, but not necessarily important. And some of the things were urgent and they were important. Some of the things, as I said, might be a commitment to a customer. A contract deliverable is due today, and for some reason it's fallen behind, and now it's urgent, and that needed to be done. But when it came to the things that were important but not urgent, hardly anybody was working on them. If they had any time left over at all from doing things that were urgent, we tended to find that they were doing things that were neither urgent nor important. Maybe a stress reliever, maybe a break, maybe just playing a game or doing something, to take their mind away from whatever they were doing. But the point was, they never really got around to doing that which was important but not urgent. That which was important but not urgent. And we looked at this, and as I've told you, part of my job was executive coaching, and we would sit down with the execs and go over these things. And the question then became, well, how do we how do we break the cycle? How do we get people to start to do those things that are important but not urgent? And if you step back and look at it far enough, a lot of the things that blew up and suddenly became urgent were things that should have been done months ago that weren't. So people just kind of procrastinated and procrastinated and procrastinated, and suddenly it blew up. Or they create a crisis because something important didn't get done. They didn't train their people properly. So now suddenly a new product hit the field and nobody was trained to work on it. Now, boom, now it's a crisis. We have to do something about it. And we started to try to figure out, well, what is it? What is the quality in the organizations that we were working with? What is it that allows people to do what is important, even if it is attached to a crisis, even if it isn't urgent? And what it came down to was discipline. Discipline. The ability to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done, even if it isn't urgent. Even if it isn't urgent. And I take that lesson into our spiritual lives because a lot of what we talk about, a lot of what the spiritual practices are, they require discipline. We have to do them. Are they urgent? No. No. If you don't sit down and meditate today, is your world going to come to an end? No. Is it important? Absolutely. Your spiritual practice will be the most important thing that you can do, because that is how you are going to get to know your spiritual self. That is how you're going to discover that spiritual essence, and to discover it in a knowing, not an information about, but a knowing. So let me just kind of explain that just a little bit. There's a difference between knowing about something and knowing. We can have all the information about it, but we may still not know it. We may be kind of like a trivia champion in a contest. We may know all kinds of little facts and figures about all kinds of things, but yet we really don't know what that is. So if you look at the difference between religion and spirituality, religion is usually about dogma and creed, and you would hope that the end game or the end purpose of religion is awakening our spirituality. But it's not necessarily so, because sometimes religions become kind of the end purpose of themselves. The end purpose of the religion is to keep the organization alive, to keep the religion alive, to discipline people or to indoctrinate people in the doctrine and the creed, indoctrinate and doctrine. So a lot of times what happens to us when we go into a religious training is we are taught facts. We are taught to memorize things, memorize Bible verses, memorize catechism, memorize the names of saints, memorize holy days. But we knew all of these different facts and figures and things, but none of that necessarily meant that we were having a spiritual experience. And in fact, in some cases, it could block our spiritual experience. Some of the things that you might have heard growing up were things like, well, don't trust yourself. Don't go within. Don't listen to the voice that you hear within, because you can't trust that. But trust what we tell you. Trust what authority tells you. I remember as a young boy, kind of 12, 13 years old, we were going through preparing for confirmation, which was a rite of passage for young boys, and the teachers prepared us by telling us, well, the bishop was going to come to town and ask us questions, and if we didn't know the answer to the question, well, we couldn't be confirmed, and we would be a great embarrassment to our family and friends and the whole congregation who had gathered there. Just imagine the humiliation of walking up to the bishop and having the bishop ask you a question that you couldn't answer. That was the guilt that they used to get us to memorize what the things that they wanted us to memorize. And that, I understand that that was a way of teaching, that was a way of motivating, and that was a way of preparing. But my point is that was memorizing facts. That was memorizing facts. That was looking at the browser history. And that was not necessarily an indication of how well and whether we knew ourselves spiritually. So I want to go over a couple of techniques so that, you know, it's not just an abstract, that we have a way of doing it. But I really hope to impress impress upon our minds the importance of getting to know our spiritual self. That I can't think of anything more important to accomplish in this lifetime, in this time that we have here on earth. Now, going back to the analogy of the mirror, kind of following along that, I want you to think about light for just a moment. Typically, we do not see light. We see what light reflects off of. So as I sit here in a room and I look out the window, you know, we have a storage shed in the yard, and it's got white siding on it, and the sun is bouncing off it, and it is glowing. It is glowing. But yet I don't see the light. I see the reflection of the light. Now, it's important that we have these things around that we can see, but they're not the light. In a similar fashion, if I said to you, look in the room, what is the room? We would look around at the walls. We would look around at the windows. We would look around at the furniture, but we wouldn't see the space that is the room. The space is the room. Now, the walls help us to know the space, but we never think of the space. We think of the room, we think of the color of the walls, we think of the floor covering, we think of the furniture. And it is the space that really makes the room. As the mirror is the pure consciousness, think of yourself as the light. Think of yourself as the space in the room. And think of the objects that are around, the things that gather your attention. They are simply reflecting back to you where your consciousness is at the moment. So they are things that you can use, they are tools that you can use that reflect to you where you are in your spiritual path, where you are in your spiritual growth. What is it that gathers your attention? What is it that you focus your attention on? Where is your day? Are you busy doing things that are urgent? Are you doing things that are important? Are you doing things that are neither? Are you doing things that are both? Reflect upon your discipline, where your time is going. So one of the first things that we can do, one of the first techniques that we can use, is we can learn to remain undisturbed or not tangled in the drama of the day, the drama of our emotions. I was reading something this morning that just kind of really jumped out, and the author was talking about a parable concerning the Buddha. And the Buddha was on his way from one town to another, and he had to pass through a town in the middle. And as he passed through the town in the middle, the villagers were very rude to him. They called him names, they insulted him, they were just being abusive to him. And he just stood there and he listened for a little while, and he said to them, Are you finished? Are you done? Because I have to be at this other town by sundown, so I need to get going. But, you know, if you're not finished, what I'll do is on my way back, I'll stop here and you can talk to me some more. And the people were astonished, and they said to him, why would you do that? We're abusing you, we're yelling at you, we're calling you names, we're doing all these things. And he says, no, you don't even know who I am. And if you would have caught me 10 years ago and yelled at me, it would have been a good argument because I would have believed you. But now I know who I am. And you can't force me to do the thing you want me to do, which is to be mad at you. And I thought, wow, isn't that something? You know, if we, you and I, if we cannot remain undisturbed, if we get so entangled with the words and the things that are going on that we can't help but become engaged and fight back, then we can be easily manipulated. Easily manipulated. People can force us to act. And if you look in the news, you look in politics, you look in the world, you see what's going on, particularly now that we have social media where you can get 10,000 people or 10,000 bots to tweet out nasty things about somebody. They're caught up in this act, react, act, react, act, react. The world is doing that which is urgent, but doesn't seem to be getting around to what is important. So the first thing we want to think about is be aware, be an observer of yourself and be aware. Be aware of when your emotions are coming up, when you are becoming entangled, when you are becoming angry, when you're becoming afraid, all of those different things. Just be aware that that is arising. Just be aware of it. And remind yourself, remain undisturbed. Remain undisturbed. Can you just witness it? Can you just observe it? Can you recognize that whatever the people are doing that you're getting upset about is not even the truth anyway? They don't know who you are. You don't even know who you are, probably. So what is the value in getting upset about it? And we think, well, that's easy to say, you know, but when you're right in the thick of things and it comes up, you know, what do you do then? And here's where the discipline comes in. You practice. You practice before. You practice before you find yourself in that situation where you want to yell back or lash out or defend yourself in some way. And it's easy to do. It's easy to do because we spend so much time identifying with our past, it's easy for us to call up a memory. Just as it was probably very easy for everyone to remember when the first time they rode a bicycle without training wheels. You can remember a time when you were angry, you were insulted, you wanted to punch somebody in the nose, you know. You can remember that. And as soon as you start to invoke that memory, as soon as it starts to come up, your body seems to get engaged, you know. Your heart might start beating fast, your face will turn red, your breathing will change, and by God, you're right back there in whatever that event was. And you are entangled with it, and you are caught up with it, and it's not even real. It's just a memory, see? It's just a memory. It's not real. And right then you can say to yourself, remain undisturbed. Remain undisturbed. And you can learn to break that pattern by practicing, by spiritual discipline, by doing what is important even before it becomes urgent. Another thing that you can do is you can just observe the world around you as if it was a movie on a screen. It's just a drama playing out on the screen. There's just characters and actors who are coming in and they're just reading their lines. And that's all that's going on. That's all that's going on. There's no need to become entangled. There's no need to argue. There's no need to fight. It's all going away anyway. in 100 years, whatever it was that they were so upset about will not matter. It will be gone. But your real self, your spiritual self, will still be. I mentioned a week or so ago this quote allegedly attributed to the Buddha that floats around the internet about once a week, and it says, the problem is you think you have time. The problem is you think you have time. Why are we here? Why did we come to this place at this time? Why are we living out our lives on planet Earth right now? Is it to get more stuff? Is it to build bigger buildings? Is it to impose our will on others? To be dominant, to win? And I think not. I think those are the unimportant things. Peer pressure in society has made them urgent for many people. But I think the most important thing is that we have come here to discover ourself, to know ourself. This is a perfect place to do that, because just as light reflects off of the objects around it and reveals something about them and about the very nature of light itself, the things that play out in our lives, the way that we engage or disengage, tell us something about our authentic self, our spiritual self, our real self. So let's let go of the dust on the mirror. Let's make the time. Let's develop the discipline to do the most important thing that we can ever do, which is spiritual practice that helps us to know by experience the self. And what happens is, as we do that, we recognize that that the mirror itself that we thought we were, I'm not the dust, but I'm the mirror. And now we realize I'm not even the mirror, because I am not. Only God is. Only God is. See, we first have to discover our own self, our true self, our authentic self, our spiritual self. And once we discover that, we discover the self with a capital S. Our conscious contact, our conscious awareness of our contact with the presence of the divine. I invite you to take a look at your day. How many hours do you sleep? How many hours are you awake? How many hours do you exercise? How many hours do you work? How many hours do you do you prepare meals and eat meals, run errands, and all of the other things that you do? You know, if you were to do a time study on yourself. And at the end of the day, if you would draw a line and total up the amount of time, the percentage of the time, the percentage of your 24 hours that you actually spent being present and knowing the self, how much would it be? I'm guessing that whatever it is, you would look at it and say, it's not enough. It's not enough. That is the most important thing in my life. It is the thing that I will take with me when I leave this life. And I want to spend more time on it. And the way to do that is discipline. The ability to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Discipline. So I invite you to reflect this week. Reflect upon your time. The problem is we think we have time. We'll get around to it in that future. But the only time we have is now. We have to do it now. There's a famous quote by Rabbi Hillel, and there's no context to it whatsoever. It's just a little sentence written in Sayings of Our Fathers, a book of Judaism. And the quote is as follows: "If not us, who? If not now, when? Now is the time. We are the people." I invite you this week, today, make time to know yourself. And so it is.